The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in July 1882, and Victoria Ellsworth knew before she opened it that her father was dying. She stood in the sweltering heat outside the general store in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the yellow paper, reading words that confirmed what her heart already understood. Her father had suffered a stroke in San Francisco and was calling for her, his only living child, to come say goodbye before it was too late. The problem was simple and insurmountable. Victoria had exactly $14 to her name, saved penny by penny from her wages as a seamstress, and the train ticket to California cost $12. That left $2 for food and lodging during a journey that would take the better part of a week. She had no family in Scottsbluff, no one to borrow from, no one who owed her favors. She had come west 3 years ago with her aunt, who had since passed, leaving Victoria alone in a town where she was known but not quite belonging. She walked to the train station anyway, clutching the telegram like a talisman. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty Main Street, and her dark blue dress absorbed the heat until she felt she might faint. The station was a modest wooden building with a covered platform, and inside, the ticket agent looked up from his ledger with the weary expression of a man who had heard every hard luck story the frontier could produce. "I need a ticket to San Francisco," Victoria said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The next available train." The agent consulted his schedule. "Train leaves at 4 this afternoon, gets into Cheyenne tonight, then you transfer to the westbound express tomorrow morning. Should have you in San Francisco in 5 days, God willing and the tracks hold." He looked up at her with pale eyes. "That will be $12. Victoria counted out her money carefully, laying the bills and coins on the counter. $12 exactly. The agent was just reaching for the money when the door behind her opened, bringing with it a blast of hot wind and the jingle of spurs. "Hold on there, Charlie," a deep voice said. The agent's hand froze. Victoria turned to find a tall man silhouetted in the doorway. As he stepped inside, she could make out his features. Weather-beaten skin, dark hair that needed cutting, and gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore dusty trail clothes and a battered hat, and there was a certain economy to his movements that spoke of someone comfortable in his own skin. "Graham Morgan," the agent said, his tone shifting to something more deferential. "What can I do for you?" "Need a ticket on that 4 o'clock to Cheyenne," the man said. He glanced at Victoria, and she saw his gaze flick to the telegram still clutched in her other hand, to the careful way she had counted out her money, to the worn patches on her dress that she had mended so carefully that they were nearly invisible. "I am purchasing a ticket," Victoria said firmly. "I was here first." "Yes, madam, I can see that," Graham said. Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. There was no mockery there, no challenge. The agent cleared his throat. "I am afraid there is a complication. We only have 1 ticket left for this afternoon's train. The Cattle Buyers Convention in Cheyenne has every seat spoken for, and we have been oversold for days. I have been holding this last ticket for Mr. Morgan here. He sent word 3 days ago that he would need passage." Victoria felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "But I need to go today. My father is dying." The words came out raw and desperate, and she hated the sound of them. Graham Morgan stepped up to the counter beside her. Up close, she could smell horse and leather and the clean scent of sage. "Charlie, let me see that ticket." The agent hesitated, then slid a printed ticket across the counter. Graham picked it up, looked at it for a long moment, then set it down in front of Victoria. "Take it," he said quietly. "I will follow on horseback." Victoria stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" "Your father is dying. Mine is already dead, has been for 10 years. Whatever business I have in Cheyenne can wait a few extra days. He pushed the ticket closer to her. Take it. That is over 100 miles, Victoria said, her mind struggling to process what he was offering. Through rough country, it will take you days. I have made harder rides. Graham turned to the agent. Charlie, put the ticket in the lady's name. But Mr. Morgan, you paid a deposit, the agent protested. Consider it a gift. Graham was already turning toward the door. The train leaves at 4. Yes, sir. Then I need to get my horse provisioned. He touched the brim of his hat to Victoria. Safe travels, madam. I hope you make it in time. He was gone before Victoria could find words, the door swinging shut behind him. She looked down at the ticket, now made out in her name in the agent's careful script, and felt tears prick her eyes. He is a good man, the agent said quietly. One of the best. Runs a horse ranch about 20 miles north of here. He was heading to Cheyenne to negotiate a contract for cavalry mounts. That contract could make or break his operation for the year. Victoria carefully folded the ticket and placed it in her reticule. Where would I find him? I need to thank him properly. Likely at the livery stable. But miss, if you are catching the 4 o'clock, you do not have much time. It is nearly 3 now. Victoria hurried back to her small room behind the seamstress shop where she worked. Her landlady, Mrs. Chen, was surprised to see her rushing in at this hour, but when Victoria explained about her father, the older woman helped her pack the few belongings that mattered. 2 changes of clothes, her mother's Bible, the photograph of her parents on their wedding day. You come back to Scottsbluff, Mrs. Chen asked in her careful English as she pressed a packet of food into Victoria's hands. I do not know, Victoria said honestly. It depends on what I find in San Francisco. She made it to the livery stable with 20 minutes to spare. Inside the dim interior, she found Graham Morgan checking the shoes on a sturdy bay gelding. He looked up when her shadow fell across the doorway. I needed to thank you, Victoria said, suddenly feeling shy. What you did, giving up your ticket, it was the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. Graham straightened, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the dust from his hands. No thanks needed. Anyone decent would have done the same. I do not think that is true, Victoria said softly. I have met many people, and most would not have given up something so important to a stranger. He regarded her steadily, and she had the sense of being truly seen, not just looked at. What is your name, Victoria? Victoria Ellsworth. Graham Morgan. He offered his hand, and when she took it, his grip was warm and calloused and steady. Where in San Francisco is your father? The letter came from St. Mary's Hospital. She pulled out the telegram and showed him the address. I am to ask for Dr. Henderson. Graham nodded slowly. I know the area. It is a decent hospital. They will take good care of him. He hesitated, then added, I am sorry about your father, Miss Ellsworth. I hope you get there in time. How long will it take you to reach Cheyenne? Victoria asked. 3 days, maybe 4. Depends on the weather and how the trail rides. He patted the bay's neck. Timber here is a good horse. He will get me there. The train whistle sounded shrill and urgent. Victoria jumped. I have to go. Yes, you do. Graham walked with her to the stable door. The train station was just across the dusty street, and she could see the locomotive already building steam, black smoke puffing into the clear blue sky. Victoria paused at the doorway and turned back to him. In the slanting afternoon light, his face was all plains and shadows, but his eyes were kind. I will pay you back, she said. For the ticket, for the deposit you lost. I do not know how yet, but I will. Do not worry about that, Graham said. Just get to your father, that is payment enough. She wanted to say more, but the train whistle sounded again, more insistent this time. Victoria gathered her skirts and ran across the street, clutching her small bag. The conductor was just calling the final boarding when she reached the platform, breathless and flushed. As the train pulled away from Scottsbluff, Victoria found a seat by the window and looked back at the town. The livery stable was just visible, and she thought she could see a tall figure standing in the doorway, watching the train depart. She pressed her hand against the window glass, a gesture of gratitude and goodbye, and then the train rounded a bend and Scottsbluff disappeared behind a rise of golden prairie grass. The journey to San Francisco was both endless and too quick. Victoria transferred trains in Cheyenne, then again in Ogden, and finally found herself on the westbound express that would carry her over the Sierra Nevada and down into California. She spent most of the journey staring out the window at the passing landscape, her mind occupied with memories of her father and worries about what she would find when she reached San Francisco. But in the quiet moments, especially at night when the rocking of the train made sleep impossible, she found herself thinking about Graham Morgan, the way he had looked at that ticket, knowing what it cost him to give it up, the quiet certainty in his voice when he said he would follow on horseback, the warmth of his hand when they shook goodbye. She knew nothing about him except that he raised horses and had a kind heart. She did not even know if she would ever see him again. But something had passed between them in those few minutes at the train station, something that felt important in a way she could not quite name. The train pulled into San Francisco on a foggy morning, and Victoria stumbled onto the platform exhausted and travel-worn. She used her last dollar to hire a cab to take her to St. Mary's Hospital, a stolid brick building in a respectable neighborhood south of Market Street. Dr. Henderson was a brisk, efficient man with sympathetic eyes. "Miss Ellsworth, I am glad you made it. Your father has been asking for you. He is very weak, but he is still conscious. The stroke affected his left side and his speech is somewhat impaired, but his mind is clear." Victoria followed the doctor up 2 flights of stairs to a ward where white-painted iron beds held the sick and dying. Her father was in a bed by the window, and when she saw him, she had to stifle a gasp. Thomas Ellsworth had always been a robust man, tall and barrel-chested with a booming laugh. The figure in the bed was a shadow of that man, his face gray and slack on one side, his powerful frame diminished. But when he saw her, his good eye brightened and his right hand reached out tremulously. "Vicky," he managed, the words slurred but recognizable. She took his hand and sat beside the bed, tears streaming down her face. "I am here, Papa. I came as fast as I could." Over the next 3 days, Victoria rarely left her father's side. The doctors had been clear that there was no hope of recovery. The stroke had been massive, and it was only Thomas Ellsworth's stubborn constitution that had kept him alive this long. But they were good days, despite the shadow of death hanging over them. Thomas could not speak much, but he could listen, and Victoria talked to him about her life in Scottsbluff, about her work as a seamstress, about the friends she had made. She did not tell him about Graham Morgan. That felt too private, too uncertain to share. Thomas Ellsworth died peacefully on a Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week after Victoria had received the telegram. She was holding his hand, and she felt the moment he slipped away, his labored breathing simply stopping, his features relaxing into something that looked almost like contentment. The funeral was small. Victoria had not known her father had friends in San Francisco, but 6 men showed up at the graveside, old sailors who had worked with Thomas on the docks. They told her stories she had never heard, about her father's courage and his fairness and his loyalty to his crew. It helped a little to know that he had been loved by more than just her. The lawyer who handled her father's meager estate gave her surprising news. Thomas Ellsworth had owned a small house in San Francisco, purchased years ago when property was cheap. It was rented out to a family of Portuguese fishermen who paid $20 a month in rent. After all debts were settled, Victoria found herself with the house, $300 in savings that her father had hoarded, and the monthly rental income. She was not wealthy, but she was no longer desperate. She could afford the train ticket back to Scottsbluff. She could afford to pay Graham Morgan back for what he had lost by giving up his ticket. But first, she needed to decide whether she was going back to Scottsbluff at all. San Francisco offered opportunities that Nebraska did not. The city was growing rapidly, and seamstresses were in demand. She could make a good living here, maybe even open her own shop someday. The problem was that, when she thought about staying in San Francisco, her heart felt heavy. And when she thought about returning to Scottsbluff, she felt a flutter of something that might have been anticipation or might have been fear. She suspected that flutter had a lot to do with a gray-eyed cowboy who had given her his train ticket and promised to follow on horseback. Victoria made her decision on a Friday morning, 2 weeks after she had left Scottsbluff. She sold her father's house to a speculator for a fair price, arranged for the proceeds and her father's savings to be transferred to the bank in Scottsbluff, and bought a ticket on the eastbound train leaving the next day. The journey back felt faster than the journey out, perhaps because she was no longer racing against death. She changed trains in Ogden and again in Cheyenne, and on a warm afternoon in August, the train pulled into Scottsbluff. Victoria stepped onto the platform with her bags, looking around at the familiar dusty street, the false-fronted buildings, the endless expanse of prairie stretching to the horizon. It was not beautiful exactly, but it felt like home in a way San Francisco never had. Mrs. Chen was delighted to have her back, and her old room was still available. Victoria unpacked her few belongings, including the considerable sum of money she now carried, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, trying to gather her courage for what came next. She needed to find Graham Morgan. She needed to thank him again, and to pay him back for the ticket. And if she was being honest with herself, she needed to see if that flutter she had felt, that sense of connection, had been real or just a product of stress and grief. The next morning she put on her best dress, a deep green cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and walked to the livery stable. The owner, a bandy-legged man named Pete, was grooming a mule when she arrived. "Excuse me," Victoria said. "I am looking for Graham Morgan." "I was told he has a horse ranch north of town." Pete straightened, giving her an appraising look. "Morgan Ranch, about 20 miles up the North Platte. You the lady he gave his train ticket to?" Victoria blinked. "How did you know about that?" "Small town, miss. Story like that gets around." Pete grinned, showing a gap between his front teeth. "Graham rode out of here that same afternoon you took the train. Pushed hard to make Cheyenne in 3 days. Heard he got there just in time to catch the cattle buyer before the man left for Omaha. Saved his contract." Relief washed over Victoria. So Graham had not lost everything by helping her. "Is he back?" "Got back about 4 days ago. Came into town yesterday to pick up supplies, in fact. Should be out at his place now." Pete hesitated, then added, "You need to go out there. I can rent you a horse and a saddle, $5 for the day." It was a significant sum, but Victoria had money now. She paid Pete, and within half an hour found herself mounted on a gentle mare, riding north along a wagon road that followed the twisting course of the North Platte River. The country was beautiful in a spare, austere way. Rolling grassland stretched in every direction, broken by the occasional stand of cottonwoods along the river. The sky was enormous, a perfect blue dome unmarred by clouds. Victoria had learned to ride as a child, and the familiar rhythm of the horse beneath her was soothing. She found the Morgan Ranch just where Pete had described it, where a creek joined the North Platte. The ranch was modest but well-maintained. A sturdy log house with a covered porch, a large barn, several corrals holding horses at various stages of training, and a few outbuildings. Cottonwoods provided shade, and she could hear the musical sound of running water. Graham was in one of the corrals, working with a young horse on a lunge line. He wore no hat, and his dark hair gleamed in the sunlight. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, showing tanned forearms, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who understood horses. Victoria dismounted at the gate, suddenly nervous. What if he barely remembered her? What if her journey out here was presumptuous, unwelcome? But then Graham saw her, and his face lit up with unmistakable pleasure. He said something to the horse, gave it a pat, and walked over to the gate. "Miss Ellsworth," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "You are back." "I am back," she agreed, finding herself smiling. "I wanted to thank you again. I made it to San Francisco in time. I had 3 days with my father before he died." Graham's expression sobered. "I am glad you had that time. I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Victoria reached into her reticule and pulled out an envelope. "I also wanted to pay you back for the ticket and for the deposit you lost." Graham looked at the envelope but did not take it. "That is not necessary." "It is to me." Victoria held it out insistently. "You lost money by helping me. I can afford to pay you back now. My father left me a small inheritance." Graham studied her face for a long moment, then took the envelope. But instead of opening it, he tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Will you come inside? I just made coffee, and I would like to hear about your father if you feel like talking about it." Victoria found herself nodding, and Graham opened the gate for her. He took her horse and tied it to a hitching post in the shade, then led her up to the house. The interior was simple but clean. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, a table and chairs that looked handmade. It had the neat, spare quality of a place kept by a man who lived alone but took pride in his home. Graham poured coffee into 2 tin cups and gestured for Victoria to sit at the table. She did, and he sat across from her, his hands wrapped around his own cup. "Tell me about your father," he said quietly. So she did. She told him about Thomas Ellsworth, about his years as a merchant sailor, and then as a dock foreman in San Francisco. She told him about her mother, who had died when Victoria was 12, and about how her father had struggled to raise a daughter alone. She told him about the stroke, and the hospital, and those final 3 days when she had sat beside her father's bed and said all the things that needed to be said. Graham listened without interrupting, his gray eyes steady on her face, and Victoria found herself telling him things she had not planned to share. About her fear of being alone in the world. About her grief, but also her gratitude that her father had not suffered long. About the difficult decision to return to Scottsbluff instead of staying in San Francisco. When she finally fell silent, Graham refilled her coffee cup. "Why did you come back?" he asked. "If you had money from your father's estate, you could have made a new life in California." Victoria wrapped her hands around the warm cup, considering her answer carefully. "I thought about it, but San Francisco never felt like home. I have friends here, a job I enjoy. Mrs. Chen is kind to me." She paused, then added with careful honesty, "And I wanted to see you again. To thank you properly. To see if what I felt that day at the train station was real or just my imagination." The air between them seemed to thicken. Graham leaned forward slightly. "And what did you feel?" "Connection," Victoria said simply. "Like meeting you mattered somehow. Like you were important." She felt her cheeks heat. "I know that probably sounds foolish. We only spoke for a few minutes." "It does not sound foolish," Graham said quietly. "I felt it too." The admission hung between them, fragile and significant. Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just a kind stranger who had helped her, but a man. A good man, with calloused hands and patient eyes and a gentleness that extended to nervous horses and grieving women. "Would you like to see the ranch?" Graham asked after a moment. "I could show you the horses." They spent the afternoon walking the property, and Graham proved to be a good guide. He showed her the brood mares with their leggy foals, the young horses he was training for saddle, the sturdy geldings he was preparing for the cavalry contract he had secured in Cheyenne. He talked about his plans for the ranch, his hope to develop a reputation for producing quality horses that were steady and reliable. "I am not trying to breed racehorses," he explained as they leaned against a corral fence, watching a dun mare graze with her foal. "I want horses that will keep a cavalryman alive or carry a family safely across the prairie. Horses with good sense and good hearts." "Like Timber?" Victoria asked, remembering the bay gelding he had been preparing for the ride to Cheyenne. "Exactly like Timber." Graham smiled. "He got me to Cheyenne in 3 days, never took a lame step. That is the kind of horse I want to be known for." The sun was lowering toward the horizon when Victoria finally said she needed to head back to Scottsbluff. Graham insisted on riding with her, saying the road could be dangerous after dark. They rode side by side in comfortable silence for a while, then Graham said, "Would you come back? To visit, I mean. I would like to see you again." Victoria felt warmth spread through her chest. "I would like that very much." "Sunday," Graham suggested. "I could pick you up in town, bring you out for the day, I make a decent stew, and we could ride down to the river. There is a spot where the cottonwoods grow thick, and it is cool even in the heat of summer." "Sunday sounds perfect," Victoria agreed. And it was perfect. Sunday came, and Graham arrived in town driving a small wagon, looking scrubbed and presentable in clean clothes. They rode out to the ranch, and Victoria helped him prepare a meal in his simple kitchen, their movements falling into an easy rhythm as if they had cooked together many times before. After they ate, they rode down to the river, and Graham showed her the grove of cottonwoods he had mentioned. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones, and the dappled shade was deliciously cool. They sat on the bank and talked about everything and nothing. Their childhoods, their dreams, the books they had read, the places they wanted to see. "I have always wanted to see the ocean," Graham admitted. "Real ocean, not just pictures in books." "It is magnificent," Victoria said. "Terrifying and beautiful at the same time. So vast you cannot see the other side, and it is always moving, always changing." "Maybe someday," Graham said, and Victoria heard the wistfulness in his voice. "Maybe someday we could go together," she found herself saying, and then blushed at her own boldness. But Graham just smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I would like that." The summer passed in a golden haze of happiness. Victoria continued her work as a seamstress, but every Sunday she spent at the Morgan Ranch. Sometimes she brought mending to do while Graham worked with his horses, her needle flashing in the sunlight as she sat on the porch. Other times she helped him with ranch chores, learning to groom horses and mend tack and cook over a fire. They talked endlessly, discovering each other's histories and hopes. Graham told her about growing up in Missouri, about coming west after his parents died of cholera, about the years he had spent working for other ranchers before saving enough to buy his own land. Victoria told him about her peripatetic childhood, following her father from port to port, about the aunt who had brought her to Nebraska, and then died unexpectedly, leaving Victoria stranded but strangely content. "I was so angry at first," Victoria confessed one afternoon as they rode along the river. "Angry at Aunt Martha for dying, angry at my father for being in San Francisco instead of with me. But now I think maybe it was meant to be. I like it here. I like the work I do, the independence I have. I like who I am becoming. I like who you are too, Graham said quietly, and the look he gave her made her heart race. The first kiss happened on a September evening with the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink. They had been picking late plums from a tree near the house, and Victoria had reached for a high branch at the same moment Graham did. Their hands touched, and suddenly they were standing very close, the basket of plums forgotten. Graham cupped her face in his hands, his palms rough and warm against her skin. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes," Victoria breathed, and then his lips were on hers, soft and sure and perfect. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Graham rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you, Victoria Ellsworth," he said. "I think I started falling that day at the train station, and I have not stopped since." "I am falling in love with you too," Victoria whispered. "I think I have been waiting for you my whole life without knowing it." After that, their relationship deepened and sweetened. They were courting now, officially and openly, and the people of Scottsbluff approved. Mrs. Chen beamed whenever Graham came to collect Victoria, and the other seamstresses teased her gently about her cowboy beau. In October, Graham asked Victoria to marry him. They were sitting on his porch watching the sunset, wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill, and he simply said, "Marry me, Victoria. Make this house a home. Make my life complete." Victoria turned to look at him, this good man who had changed her life by giving up a train ticket, and said, "Yes, yes, with all my heart, yes." They were married in November in a simple ceremony at the church in Scottsbluff. Victoria wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored wool with lace at the collar and cuffs. Graham wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. Mrs. Chen cried happy tears, and Pete from the livery stable served as Graham's best man. Victoria moved her few belongings out to the ranch, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly at home. She and Graham fell into a partnership that felt natural and right. She managed the household and continued her sewing, taking in work from women in town and from the wives of neighboring ranchers. Graham worked with his horses and slowly expanded the operation, his reputation for quality stock growing throughout the territory. Their first winter together was hard but happy. The snow came early and heavy, and there were days when they were snowed in completely, unable to reach town or see another soul. But they had laid in good supplies, and the house was snug and warm. They spent the long evenings reading aloud to each other, playing cards and talking by the fire. They learned each other's bodies and hearts with patient tenderness, discovering the deep satisfaction of physical and emotional intimacy. Spring came late but glorious, the prairie exploding with wildflowers. Victoria discovered she was pregnant on a morning in April when she woke feeling queasy and suddenly realized her courses were 6 weeks late. She told Graham that evening, nervous about how he would react, but he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, whooping with joy. "A baby," he kept saying, his face alight with wonder. "We are going to have a baby." Their son was born on a cold January morning in 1884. The midwife from town, Mrs. O'Reilly, presided over the birth with calm competence, and Graham stayed by Victoria's side through the long hours of labor, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. When the baby finally arrived, red-faced and squalling with indignation, Graham took him in his big, gentle hands and stared at him with awe. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas after Victoria's father and called him Tommy. He was a healthy, happy baby with his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and both parents were utterly besotted with him. Life settled into a new rhythm, busy and full. Victoria learned to balance caring for Tommy with her other responsibilities, often sitting on the porch with the baby in a basket beside her while she sewed. Graham was a devoted father, coming in from the corrals multiple times a day just to hold his son, singing him nonsense songs while Victoria made dinner. The ranch continued to prosper. Graham's cavalry contract led to others, and soon he had more orders than he could fill. He hired a young man named John to help with the training, and later a second hand, allowing him to take on even more work. Victoria's sewing business also grew. She became known for her skill and fair prices, and women came from miles around to commission dresses and have their mending done. She hired a young woman from town, Sarah, to help with the overflow, and together they turned the spare room in the house into a proper workroom. Tommy grew from baby to toddler to little boy, full of energy and curiosity. He loved the horses and would sit on the corral fence for hours, watching his father work. By the time he was 5, he was already learning to ride, fearless and competent on a gentle pony Graham had trained specially for him. In 1888, Victoria gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Grace. She had Victoria's green eyes and a surprisingly fierce temperament for such a tiny person. Tommy was enchanted with his baby sister and appointed himself her protector, a role he took very seriously. The years passed in a blur of work and family, challenges and triumphs. There was the drought of 1889 that nearly broke them, when the grass turned brown and brittle, and they had to sell half the horse herd just to buy feed for the rest. There was the terrible winter of 1890 when a blizzard killed 3 of their best horses, and Victoria and Graham stood in the barn and wept together over the loss. But there were good times too. The summer Tommy won a blue ribbon at the county fair for his pony. The autumn when Graham's horses were chosen to supply the entire 9th Cavalry Regiment, securing the ranch's financial future for years to come. The countless evenings when they sat on the porch watching the sunset, children playing in the yard, and Victoria would look at Graham and marvel that this was her life. In 1893, Victoria gave birth to their 3rd child, another boy they named Henry. He was a quiet baby, thoughtful even as an infant, with a way of looking at you that suggested he understood far more than he should. The ranch house, which had once seemed so spacious, now burst at the seams with family. Graham and John built an addition, adding 2 bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. Victoria planted a garden and fruit trees, transforming the bare yard into something green and welcoming. Tommy grew tall and strong, turning into a capable young horseman who could gentle a green-broke colt with patience and skill. Grace showed an unexpected talent for drawing, filling pages with sketches of horses and prairie scenes. Henry, as he grew, revealed himself to be the scholar of the family, always with his nose in a book, asking questions about everything from the stars to steam engines. In 1896, on a warm summer evening, Victoria and Graham celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary. The children put together a surprise party, inviting neighbors and friends from town. There was food and music, and when someone brought out a fiddle, Graham led Victoria in a dance under the stars. "You remember the day we met?" Victoria asked as they swayed to the music. She was 41 now, with threads of silver in her dark hair and fine lines around her eyes. Graham was 44, his dark hair more gray than black, his face weathered by years of sun and wind. But when he looked at her, his eyes held the same warmth they had held that day at the train station. "I remember thinking you were brave," Graham said. "Standing there with that telegram, trying not to cry, determined to get to your father no matter what it cost. I remember thinking I wanted to know you better. And giving up your train ticket seemed like a good way to accomplish that. Victoria teased. Graham laughed. I will not pretend I was thinking that far ahead. I just knew you needed that ticket more than I did. But if I am being honest, yes, I was hoping I might see you again. I did not expect you to ride out to the ranch to find me, though. That was a pleasant surprise. Best decision I ever made, Victoria said. Well, second best. The best was saying yes when you asked me to marry you. I love you, Victoria Morgan, Graham said, pulling her closer. More today than the day I married you, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me, Victoria said, her eyes misty. Then I need to work on being more romantic, Graham replied, and kissed her to the applause and wolf whistles of their children and friends. The turn of the century brought changes to Scottsbluff and the surrounding territory. The town grew, adding new businesses and amenities. Telephone lines arrived, and then electricity, though it would be years before it reached the more remote ranches. The railroad expanded its service, and suddenly the wider world felt more accessible. Tommy, now 17, announced his intention to join the cavalry after he turned 18. Victoria's heart broke a little at the thought of her firstborn son riding off to war or danger, but Graham supported the decision. He is a fine horseman and a good young man, Graham told Victoria as they lay in bed discussing it. The cavalry will be lucky to have him. And it is his choice to make. I know, Victoria said. I just wish he was still my little boy. He will always be your little boy, Graham said gently, even when he is a grown man with children of his own. Tommy did indeed join the cavalry in 1899, and his letters home were full of adventure and enthusiasm. He was stationed at Fort Robinson, training recruits in horsemanship using techniques he had learned from his father. Victoria kept every letter, reading them until the paper grew soft and worn. Grace, at 14, was blossoming into a talented artist. A teacher in Scottsbluff saw her work and arranged for her to study with a professional painter in Omaha. It was hard to let her go, but Victoria and Graham agreed that she deserved the opportunity to develop her gift. Henry, at 11, announced that he wanted to be a veterinarian. He spent hours observing the horses, asking Graham detailed questions about their health and care. Graham arranged for him to apprentice with the local veterinarian during summer months, and Henry threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. In 1902, Victoria received a letter that made her cry. It was from the new owners of her father's old house in San Francisco, forwarding a letter that had been sent there years ago and lost in a pile of papers. The letter was from a cousin of her mother's, a woman named Eleanor, who had been trying to reach Victoria for years. Victoria wrote back immediately, and soon she and Eleanor were corresponding regularly. It turned out Victoria had family she had never known about, cousins in Boston, an uncle in Philadelphia. Eleanor was warm and welcoming, and she extended an open invitation for Victoria to visit. In the spring of 1903, Victoria and Graham decided to take a trip. It would be their first real journey since their wedding, a chance to see something beyond the prairie and mountains they had lived among for 2 decades. They planned an ambitious route, train to San Francisco, then north along the coast, then east to Boston to meet Victoria's newly discovered family. The children were old enough to manage without them. Tommy was on leave from the cavalry and agreed to come home to oversee the ranch with John's help. Grace would return from Omaha for the summer. Henry, at 15, was responsible enough to help manage things. So in May of 1903, Victoria and Graham found themselves standing on the platform at the Scottsbluff train station, the same platform where they had met 21 years earlier. Victoria looked at Graham and he looked at her, and they both smiled at the memory. "You ever regret it?" Victoria asked as they waited for the train. "Giving up that ticket?" Graham took her hand and raised it to his lips. "Not for a single moment. That ticket bought me the best life I could have imagined. It brought me you." The train pulled into the station, and this time they boarded together. They found seats by the window, and as the train pulled away from Scottsbluff, Victoria leaned her head on Graham's shoulder. "Do you remember what you said to me that day?" she asked. "Take it, I will follow on horseback." "I remember." "You did follow," Victoria said softly. "You have been following beside me, riding with me, ever since. We have made this journey together." Graham wrapped his arm around her. "And we will keep making it together, for as long as we both shall live." They traveled for 6 weeks, and it was glorious. They saw the Pacific Ocean, and Graham stood on the beach with tears in his eyes at the vastness of it. They took a steamship north to Seattle and marveled at the evergreen forests and snow-capped mountains. They traveled east by rail, crossing the country and seeing landscapes they had only read about in books. In Boston, they met Alina and the rest of Victoria's extended family and were welcomed with open arms. They stayed for 2 weeks, attending parties and dinners, hearing family stories and seeing old photographs. Victoria felt a piece of herself settle into place, a piece she had not even known was missing. But as wonderful as the trip was, they were both happy to return to Nebraska. They arrived home in late June to find the ranch thriving, the children well, and everything in good order. Tommy had done an excellent job managing things, and Graham clapped him on the shoulder with pride. That night, lying in their own bed with the familiar sounds of the prairie outside their window, Victoria said, "That was a wonderful trip, but I am glad to be home." "Me too," Graham agreed. "Home is wherever you are, but I am partial to this particular spot of earth." The years continued to roll by, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. Tommy met a young woman at Fort Robinson, the daughter of a fellow officer, and brought her home to meet his parents. Her name was Alice, and she was kind and sensible, and Victoria welcomed her into the family with genuine warmth. They married in 1904, and Victoria became a grandmother in 1905 when Alice gave birth to a daughter they named Victoria, after her grandmother. Grace's art career blossomed. She had several exhibitions in Omaha, and even one in Chicago, and her paintings of Western scenes became quite sought after. She married a fellow artist in 1906, a gentle man named Robert who treated her with respect and encouraged her work. Henry completed his studies and became a qualified veterinarian in 1908. He returned to Scottsbluff and opened a practice, becoming the go-to veterinarian for ranchers throughout the region. He was in no hurry to marry, being perfectly content with his work and his books. Graham turned 60 in 1912, and Victoria threw him a surprise party that drew half the county. He was gray-haired now and moved a little slower, but he still worked with horses every day, still had that patient, gentle way about him. Victoria was 57, and her sewing room was now more of a workshop, with Sarah as her full partner in a business that employed 4 women and filled orders from as far away as Denver. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis, but she could still create beautiful things when the pain was not too severe. They had been married 31 years, and their love had only deepened with time. They still sat on the porch together every evening, watching the sunset. They still held hands when they walked. They still found joy in each other's company, in the simple fact of being together. One evening in August, as they sat on the porch with the golden light slanting across the prairie, Victoria said, "You remember what I said to you that first day at the ranch, when I came to thank you for the ticket?" "You said a lot of things that day," Graham replied with a smile. "I said I felt a connection to you. That meeting you felt important." Victoria took his hand. "I was right. You are the most important thing that ever happened to me, you and our life together." Graham raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently despite the way arthritis had twisted them. "The day I gave you that train ticket was the luckiest day of my life. I thought I was just helping a stranger. I did not know I was meeting my future, my love, my everything." "I will follow on horseback," Victoria said softly. "That is what you told me, and you did. You followed me into a life we built together, step by step, day by day." "And I would do it again," Graham said. "I would give up 1,000 train tickets for one more day with you." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Around them, the ranch hummed with life. Horses in the corrals, chickens scratching in the yard, the distant sound of Henry talking to a patient in the barn he had converted to a veterinary clinic. It was not a dramatic life or a glamorous one, but it was theirs, built on a foundation of kindness and choice and love. It had all started with a train ticket and a cowboy willing to give up what he needed for a stranger with desperate eyes. And it had become something neither of them could have imagined. A love story written across the wide plains of Nebraska, a family grown strong and true, a partnership that had weathered every storm. The stars began to emerge, pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. Victoria leaned her head on Graham's shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. They would sit here until full dark fell, as they had done thousands of times before, as they would do thousands of times more, God willing. Because some journeys are measured in miles, and some in years, and some in the countless small moments that make up a life. And the best journeys are the ones you do not make alone, but with someone who will follow on horseback if that is what it takes, who will ride beside you through whatever comes, who will love you from the first moment to the last and beyond. Victoria and Graham Morgan had found that kind of love on a hot July afternoon in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, in 1882. And they had spent every day since building a life worthy of that beginning, a life full of work and laughter and children and challenges and triumphs, and above all, love. The kind of love that endures. The kind of love that matters. The kind of love that makes giving up a train ticket the easiest decision in the world, because some things are worth following on horseback, worth riding through rough country to reach, worth everything you have to give. And as they sat on their porch under the vast Nebraska sky, two people who had started as strangers and become everything to each other, they knew that they had been blessed beyond measure. They had found what everyone searches for and few find. A love that lasts, a partnership that strengthens, a life worth living every single day. Tommy and Alice eventually took over the ranch, expanding the operation and carrying on Graham's reputation for quality horses. Little Victoria grew into a bright, curious child who loved her grandparents and spent hours listening to the story of how they met, never tiring of hearing about the train ticket and the cowboy who gave it up for love. Grace's paintings hung in galleries across the Midwest, and she and Robert lived a bohemian life that raised eyebrows but suited them perfectly. They visited the ranch often, and Grace never tired of painting the landscape she had grown up in. Henry's veterinary practice thrived, and he eventually married a schoolteacher named Margaret who shared his love of learning and quiet evenings with a good book. They had 3 children who all became doctors or scientists, carrying on Henry's intellectual legacy. Graham and Victoria lived to see their golden wedding anniversary in 1933. By then, they had 11 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. The celebration was enormous, with family coming from across the country. Tommy arranged for a special surprise. He had tracked down the records from the train station and found the actual ticket stub from that day in 1882, the ticket Graham had bought and given to Victoria. He had it framed and presented it to his parents during the anniversary party. Victoria cried when she saw it, this small piece of paper that had changed everything. Graham held her hand and looked at the ticket with wonder, remembering the young man he had been, the young woman who had needed help, the impulse of generosity that had become the foundation of his entire life. They were old now, both in their 80s, moving slowly and carefully. But when Graham looked at Victoria, he still saw the beautiful woman with desperate eyes who had stood at the train station clutching a telegram. And when Victoria looked at Graham, she still saw the kind cowboy who had given up something important because it was the right thing to do. Graham Morgan died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1935, at the age of 83. He simply did not wake up one morning, and Victoria found him looking peaceful, almost smiling, as if he had gone to sleep thinking happy thoughts and just kept going. Victoria lived another 3 years, surrounded by family, still sewing when her hands allowed it, still telling the story of the train ticket to anyone who would listen. She died on a summer evening in 1938, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, the framed train ticket in her lap. Her family found her there, looking serene and content, and they all agreed that she had simply decided it was time to follow Graham wherever he had gone. Just as he had once promised to follow her on horseback, she had followed him into whatever came next, because that was what they did. They followed each other, stayed with each other, loved each other through everything. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, and the story of Graham and Victoria became family legend. Every Morgan child grew up hearing about the train ticket, about the cowboy who gave up what he needed to help a stranger, about the love that grew from that single act of kindness. The framed ticket hung in the ranch house for years, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures have the largest consequences, that kindness matters, that love can grow from the briefest of meetings if the hearts involved are open and willing. And on quiet summer evenings, when the sun set over the Nebraska prairie in shades of gold and amber, the people who lived in the Morgan Ranch house would sometimes swear they could see 2 figures on the porch, a tall cowboy and a dark-haired woman, sitting close together, holding hands, watching the stars come out over the land they had loved and the life they had built together. Because some love stories end when the lovers die, but the best ones continue, echoing through time, inspiring others, proving that kindness and courage and choosing love over convenience can create something that lasts forever. Graham Morgan gave up a train ticket in July of 1882, and in doing so, he gained everything worth having. And Victoria Ellsworth accepted that ticket and rode the train to her dying father, and then rode back to find the man who had helped her. And in doing so, she found her home and her heart and her future. They followed each other through 53 years of marriage, through joy and sorrow, through ordinary days and extraordinary ones, through all the small moments and large events that make up a life. They built something real and lasting, a family and a legacy and a love that people still talked about generations later. And it all started with a simple choice on a hot afternoon in Scottsbluff, Nebraska. To give up what you need to help someone else, and to trust that sometimes following on horseback is exactly the right thing to do.